I saw this thought the other day, really grabbed me. It was a tweet from Sam Altman.
Oh, yeah. What about?
He was wondering if maybe consciousness might be primary, with matter being sort of a downstream thing.
Wow.
Uh,
Okay. That's a pretty deep thought for social media, especially coming from someone in tech like Altman.
exactly. Philosophical bombshells, right? Usually not dropped alongside language model updates. But it really sparked this whole line of inquiry we're going to dive into today.
That's fascinating, though. It shows how these big questions about reality, about mind, are really being re-examined, especially with AI becoming so prominent.
Totally. And what's kind of emerged from that initial spark is this fresh perspective on reality, mind, matter. And it's not just one person locked away thinking.
Right. It involved AI in the process.
Yeah, it's actually a result of this really interesting collaboration between a human researcher and artificial intelligence.
Which, that in itself could be a game changer, how we actually do discovery. Imagine having an AI partner helping you connect dots across huge amounts of info.
Precisely. And the theory they developed, it's called Embodied Informational-Process Monism, EIPM for short.
Okay, EIPM. Sounds complex.
It does, but the core idea is, well, surprisingly elegant when you break it down. Basically, reality is fundamentally proto-experiential information in motion.
Okay, hold on. Proto-experiential. That's the really mind-bending part, isn't it? Suggesting the basic stuff of reality isn't just inert matter, but this flow of information that has some kind of inherent basic quality of experience, like a seed of feeling.
Exactly. So our mission for you in this deep dive is to unpack this theory, EIPM. Where did it come from? Why should you care if you're curious about consciousness or that classic mind-body problem or, the future of AI?
Right. Think of this as your way to quickly get up to speed on a potentially revolutionary idea.
And we should say this isn't just like a wild guess. The sources here are pretty deep.
Oh, yeah. Like what?
Well, everything from that initial tweet through conversations with ChatGPT, analyzing classic philosophy, think Spinoza, Leibniz, Whitehead.
Okay, the heavy hitters.
Right, but also modern stuff like integrated information theory, IIT, and Carl Friston's free energy principle.
FEP. Yeah. Very influential.
And even neuroscience,
Yeah.
looking at things like thalamocortical integration, brain LM. So a real synthesis.
So it's drawing from a lot of different fields: philosophy, physics, neuroscience, AI. Impressive groundwork.
Okay, so let's trace that journey. It really started, like I said, with that Altman tweet questioning if consciousness is primary.
Right.
So a researcher, intrigued, basically just asked ChatGPT that exact question.
And what did the AI say? I'm curious about its initial take.
Well, interestingly, its first response actually leaned towards idealism. The idea that reality is fundamentally mental.
Ah, okay. So mind first.
Yeah, and the researchers kind of saw this as like an evolutionary draft, the AI's first attempt.
Makes sense. Exploring the landscape.
But then, a week later, the researcher tried again, tweaking the prompt, asking what if mind and matter are just, two sides of the same coin?
Different angle.
And this time, ChatGPT's response shifted. It moved towards dual-aspect monism.
Okay, so seeing them as two expressions of one underlying reality, that's a significant shift.
It is. And the key here, the researchers felt, wasn't that the AI was contradicting itself, but it was more like it was mapping out different philosophical options, showing the pros and cons of each view.
Like an intellectual sparring partner almost, exploring possibilities.
Exactly. And that's when they brought in NotebookLM.
Okay, what's that? Another AI.
Yeah, it's an AI tool designed specifically to work with and find connections within large amounts of text. So the researcher uploaded a ton of sources.
Like the ones you mentioned. Spinoza, Whitehead.
Yep, their primary works. Plus key papers on IIT and FEP, relevant neuroscience research, a whole digital library focused on this question.
Got it. Feeding the beast, so to speak.
Yeah. And then came the really innovative part, this recursive process. Over 5 cycles, they labeled them A through E.
Cycles of what? Prompts.
Prompts and responses. The human would ask something, NotebookLM would synthesize information from all those sources, find patterns, maybe connections a human wouldn't spot immediately.
So it wasn't just summarizing, it was actually synthesizing. Seeing new links.
That's the idea. They called it a neural rehearsal cycle. Human prompt, AI synthesis, human refinement of the prompt based on the AI's output, and repeat. A constant loop.
Wow. That's actually really important. It means the process of developing this theory, EIPM, is almost as significant as the theory itself.
Exactly. It points towards maybe a new way of doing philosophy or even science. Thinking with AI, not just using it as a tool.
A genuine collaboration. Okay, so EIPM didn't just spring out of nowhere. It has these deep intellectual roots. Let's dig into those. Spinoza first.
Yeah, let's start with Spinoza.
Yeah.
His big idea, really radical for the time, was just one single substance underlying everything.
Right. Deus of natura, God or nature.
And what we see as mind and matter, or thought and extension as he called them, they aren't separate things. They're just two different attributes, two ways this one substance appears to us.
Like, reading the same cosmic text in two different languages.
That's a great analogy he used, yeah. Two readings, same text. The core idea is this fundamental unity, no real split.
So how does EIPM pick up on that? Does it just adopt Spinoza wholesale?
Not exactly. It takes that core monistic idea, the unity, the idea that dual appearances don't mean dual beings, but instead of Spinoza's timeless, static substance,
It substitutes something else.
yeah, it substitutes dynamic informational process as the fundamental reality. Mind and matter become the intrinsic and extrinsic aspects of this information in motion.
Okay, so unity, but dynamic and informational.
Got it. What about Leibniz? Monads, right? Always sounded a bit weird.
Yeah, windowless monads. Leibniz imagined reality made of countless fundamental units, these monads. Each one is like a little center of perception, reflecting the whole universe from its unique point of view. But windowless means they don't directly interact. How does anything happen cohesively then?
Right, that's the puzzle. Leibniz's answer was pre-established harmony. Basically, God synchronized them all perfectly from the start.
Okay. A bit of a theological deus ex machina there. How does EIPM connect to that?
Well, interestingly, Leibniz described this harmony using language that sounds really proto-informational today. He talked about each monad encoding a perspective, like a synchronized data structure.
So the information angle again.
Exactly. For EIPM, the key takeaway from Leibniz isn't the pre-established harmony part, but the idea of distributed individual perspectives arising from a unified underlying informational order without needing direct causal links stitching them together moment by moment.
So coherence comes from integration within the informational structure itself, not necessarily direct physical interaction between the perspectives.
That's the hint EIPM takes. Integration underwrites coherence. Okay,
Yeah.
so Spinoza gives us unity, Leibniz gives us distributed perspectives within that unity.
Right.
Then comes Alfred North Whitehead and what the researchers call the process turn.
Right. Shifting from substance to process. Huge move in philosophy.
What was Whitehead's core insight there?
His really radical idea was ditching static substance altogether. Reality isn't made of things, it's made of events or actual occasions, momentary happenings.
Okay, so everything is constantly happening, constantly becoming.
Precisely. And each actual occasion has two sides, or poles. A mental pole, its subjective moment of experience, how it feels from within, and a physical pole, how it objectively connects to and influences other occasions.
And these occasions aren't isolated.
No, that's crucial. Each occasion actively prehends, takes account of, inherits from past occasions, weaves them into its present moment, and then becomes data for future occasions. So being itself, ontology, becomes this ongoing recursive update.
Recursive update. It sounds very computational, very informational.
Exactly. And what's fascinating for EIPM is that Whitehead, way before modern information theory, was talking about things like the inheritance of data, efficient causes, and the influence of goals or potentials, final causes, in ways that resonate strongly.
This is mental and physical poles.
Yeah.
How do they map onto EIPM?
They map really neatly onto EIPM's intrinsic proto-experience, the mental pole's feeling, and the extrinsic relational structure, the physical pole's measurable interactions. Whitehead basically provides the dynamic event-based framework that EIPM fills with informational concepts.
Okay, so classical roots, the process turn. Now we get to the contemporary convergence, where metaphysics starts meeting empirical data from neuroscience and biology. Let's start with Giulio Tononi's IIT, Integrated Information Theory. That nasable comes up a lot.
Yeah, a tater fi. What's really groundbreaking about IIT is the attempt to actually quantify consciousness, or at least a necessary condition for it.
How does it do that?
A measures how much information a system generates as a whole, above and beyond its parts. It captures the balance between differentiation, having lots of different possible states, and integration, those states being unified into an irreducible whole.
So high A means lots of distinct states that are all bound together.
That's the idea. And IIT makes the strong claim that consciousness is this intrinsic causal power of an integrated system, the system's ability to shape its own future states. It implies consciousness might be graded, and maybe even present in systems we don't normally think of as conscious if they have the right kind of integrated structure.
Like a laptop having non-zero, even if it's tiny.
Potentially, yes, according to strict IIT. EIPM takes the core insight that informational integration is key for cohesive experience without necessarily buying into all of IIT's implications.
Oh.
It sees high A as a crucial ingredient.
Okay, ingredient number 1, integration. Next up, Carl Friston's free energy principle, FE.
It is, often discussed in neuroscience. Friston basically proposes the brain is a prediction engine. Its fundamental job is to minimize surprise, or free energy, which is the mismatch between its predictions about the world and the sensory input it actually gets.
How does it minimize surprise?
Two main ways. Either update your internal model of the world to make better predictions next time that's learning or perception, or act on the world to make the sensory input match your predictions.
Okay. Like if I reach for my coffee cup, my brain predicts feeling it, and my action makes that prediction come true.
Exactly. Perception, action, learning, they all serve this basic drive to minimize prediction error. It's a very powerful unifying framework.
So how does EIPM use FEP?
EIPM sees FEP, this active inference process, as the fundamental dynamic through which that proto-experiential information organizes itself. It's the engine driving the loop, turning basic information into embodied, intelligent systems that actively engage with their world.
Okay, so we need integrated information in this active predictive dynamic, FEP. What about an active and embodied cognition? That view emphasizes the body and environment, right?
Precisely. Thinkers like Varela, Thompson, Noe argue that cognition isn't just computation happening inside the skull. It's fundamentally shaped by having a body with certain capacities interacting with a specific environment.
So thinking is tied to doing, sensing and moving.
Yeah, they're inseparable. Experience isn't something passively received by the brain. It's actively enacted through these loops of sensing and moving, probing and responding to the world. Our embodiment is crucial.
And EIPM incorporates this too.
Definitely. EIPM argues that having a high structure isn't enough for consciousness as we typically experience it. That integrated information needs to be realized within these embodied inactive loops. A living body coupled with its environment, maybe even a social environment for higher cognition. That's the crucible where proto-experience gets shaped into rich awareness.
Okay, one more contemporary piece. Neurophenomenology, Francisco Varela again. This sounds like a methodology.
It is. Varela was very aware of the hard problem, the gap between subjective experience, first person, and objective brain science, third person. His approach, neurophenomenology, was designed to bridge that gap.
How? By correlating them.
Yes, systematically. It involves getting detailed, structured reports of people's ongoing subjective experience, shifts in attention, qualities of perception, emotional tone, and simultaneously acquiring fine-grained neural or behavioral data.
And then looking for patterns.
Exactly. You look for reliable correlations, mapping specific features of the first-person report onto specific features of the third-person data. EIPM adopts this as its core empirical method. If mind and matter are just two views of the same informational process, this careful cross-mapping is how you uncover the specific rules of that translation.
Right, it disciplines both pure introspection and purely objective measurement. Okay, so that's the rich background. Let's dive into the core principles of EIPM itself. 5 main ones, you said.
Yep, 5 interlocking principles. The first is the foundation, the proto-experiential informational substrate.
Okay, break that down. What is this substrate?
At the very bottom, EIPM says reality isn't made of just, pointless stuff or just abstract relations. It's made of dynamic informational activity. And this activity inherently has both an intrinsic aspect and an extrinsic aspect.
The intrinsic being.
The intrinsic aspect is this rudimentary proto-experience, a minimal what its likeness. Not full-blown consciousness, but the absolute basic seed of subjectivity or valence.
And the extrinsic.
That's the relational pattern. How this informational event connects with others, its measurable structure, its causal role, the part science can model and predict.
So why insist on this proto-experience at the base level? What does that buy you?
Well, the EIPM proponents argue it dissolves the traditional hard problem, instead of consciousness popping into existence out of nowhere from purely non-experiential matter.
Which seems impossible.
Right. Instead, consciousness becomes a matter of degree and organization. It's about how this already faintly experiential information gets structured and integrated. It's not conjuring something from nothing.
Okay, that makes sense. Principle 2, recursive embodied structuring. How does this build on the substrate?
So this fundamental informational activity doesn't just sit there. It naturally self-organizes into nested hierarchies. Think atoms, molecules, cells, neurons, brains, organisms. complex structures built from simpler ones.
And these structures are always embodied and embedded.
Crucially, yes, they're physically realized, morphologically embodied, like a nervous system in a body. They're coupled to an environment ecologically embedded, constantly interacting. And for complex creatures like us, they're also socially embedded in cultures, languages, symbol systems.
And the recursive part, what does that add?
That points back to the prediction action loops we talked about with FEP. These loops happen at all levels, across different timescales from milliseconds in neuronal firing to years in learning and development. EIPM argues it's this constant recursion, this cycling of prediction, action, feedback, and update that takes the raw proto-experience and shapes, refines, polishes it into the kind of rich, stable consciousness we experience.
Okay, so raw potential gets structured through embodied recursive loops. Principle 3 focuses on consciousness itself. Consciousness, high A, plus active inference.
Right. This principle brings together the two key metrics we discussed from Tononi and Friston. It proposes that consciousness, especially the vivid, unified kind we associate with wakefulness, requires both high levels of integrated information.
Meaning a complex, unified informational state.
And the system actively using that information to make predictions and minimize errors in real time. Active inference, or F. It's not just about having integrated information, it's about doing something with it, engaging the world predictively.
So consciousness is inherently active, not passive.
That's the claim. Think about general anesthesia. Brain connectivity breaks down, plummets, and your ability to actively predict and respond vanishes. You're unconscious.
Okay. What about dreaming? You're not interacting with the world, but it feels conscious.
Good point. In REM sleep, brain activity can be highly integrated, maybe even high A, supporting the dream narrative. You are running internal predictive models, even if disconnected from external sensory input. EIPM suggests that full, world-engaged consciousness needs both high A and active inference directed outwards, but internal conscious states like dreaming might primarily rely on high A and internal predictive loops.
And this has implications for AI consciousness.
Big time. EIPM predicts that for an AI to be genuinely conscious in a way comparable to us, it would need not just a complex integrated architecture, high, but also this intrinsic drive for active inference engaging with its environment, making predictions relevant to its own persistence or goals.
Okay. Principle 4 tackles the mind-body problem head-on, dual aspects as viewpoints. How does EIPM frame this?
It basically says stop thinking of mind and matter as two different kinds of stuff that somehow interact. Instead, think of them as two different perspectives on the same underlying thing.
The same underlying informational process.
Exactly. There's the intrinsic view, the first-person perspective. What does that high, actively inferring system feel like from the inside? That's your subjective experience, your qualia.
And the extrinsic view.
That's the third-person perspective. What does that same system look like and do from the outside? That's its behavior, its measurable neural activity, its physical structure that science studies.
So it's like looking at a coin. Heads and tails are different views, but it's one coin.
Precisely. There's no deep ontological gap between mind and matter in this view, just an epistemic one. We can't occupy both the first-person intrinsic viewpoint and the third-person extrinsic viewpoint of the exact same process simultaneously.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Think of a musician lost in playing music. Their subjective feeling of flow, the emotions the music evokes, that's the intrinsic view, the complex patterns of neural firing, the predictive coding of melodies and rhythms that a neuroscientist might measure, that's the extrinsic view. EIPM says these aren't two separate things happening, but two ways of accessing the same underlying integrated informational process.
Okay, that reframing seems powerful. Finally, principle 5, the bridging method. Disciplined first-third-person correlation. This sounds like the practical application of Principle 4.
It is. It's basically adopting Varela's neurophenomenology as the core methodology. Because EIPM posits these two viewpoints on one process, you need a rigorous way to connect them empirically.
How does that work in practice?
You need to systematically. 1. Elicit detailed, structured reports about first-person experience. What is the quality of awareness? How focused is attention? What's the emotional tone? 2. Simultaneously acquire fine-grained objective data neural activity, EEG, fMRI, behavior, physiological measures.
And then 3, correlate them.
Yeah. Correlate, iterate, build predictive models. Can changes in the subjective report reliably predict changes in the neural data and vice versa? The goal is to uncover the specific mappings, the translation rules, between the dynamics of EA and active inference, the extrinsic view, and the qualities of subjective experience, the intrinsic view.
So it's about finding the precise link between the feeling and the function.
Exactly. It avoids the extremes of saying only introspection matters or only objective measurement matters. You need both, carefully aligned, to understand the whole picture.
Okay, so those 5 principles together, informational substrate, recursive embodiment, plus active inference, dual aspects, and neurophenomenology define EIPM. How does this framework stack up against classic philosophical problems?
Well, it offers potential solutions, or at least different ways of thinking about them. Take the interaction problem. How can non-physical mind affect physical body?
Right, Descartes' dilemma.
EIPM says it's a pseudo-problem created by assuming mind and body are fundamentally different substances. If there's just 2 aspects of the same informational process, then causal interactions happen within that unified process. No need for spooky interaction across categories.
What about the combination problem? If fundamental bits have proto-experience, why aren't we just a chaotic jumble of tiny feelings instead of one unified consciousness?
EIPM addresses this through integration, through SC. It argues that unified consciousness only arises when those proto-experiential informational units become part of a maximally irreducible causal structure, a system whose whole is vastly more integrated than its parts.
So only systems with sufficiently high F-mind experiences together into one subject.
That's the idea. Loose collections of information or systems that can be easily broken down into independent parts don't achieve that unified experiential state. Their micro-experiences, if any, remain fragmented.
And you mentioned it tries to avoid pure idealism or pure physicalism.
Yeah, it aims for a middle ground. Against idealism, only mind exists, EIPM insists on the reality of the extrinsic, measurable, shared informational structure. It's not all just in my head. There's a public reality.
And against physicalism, only physical stuff exists.
Against reductive physicalism, EIPM insists on the intrinsic, proto-experiential nature of information itself. Consciousness isn't an inexplicable add-on to dead matter. It's an intensification of a property, inherent, in a basic form, in the fabric of reality.
The researchers also laid out a formal deductive structure. That sounds pretty rigorous.
It is. They try to build it logically. Premise 1. The proto-experiential information thesis reality is made of informational events with intrinsic feel and extrinsic structure. Premise 2. The integration prediction principle, however, plus active inference yields unified consciousness. Conclusion. Embodied conscious realizers systems meeting these criteria, like us, are conscious.
So a step-by-step argument. Did they anticipate criticisms?
Yes, they address several. One big one is, isn't proto-experience just hand-waving? Where's the proof?
Right, it sounds speculative.
EIPM's response is that it's a theoretical postulate needed to solve deep problems, like the hard problem. Its value, they argue, lies in its explanatory power and its ability to generate testable predictions, even if the proto-experience itself isn't directly measurable yet.
What about the objection that you could build, say, a complex computer circuit with high out, but nobody thinks it's conscious?
That's a common challenge to IIT as well. EIPM's answer involves principle 3. High I isn't enough. The system also needs active inference. It needs to be doing something meaningful with that information, driven by intrinsic goals related to its own persistence or organization, not just passively computing based on external inputs. Standard computer circuits usually lack that intrinsic, self-maintaining dynamic.
Okay, so it has philosophical defenses, but you said it generates testable predictions. How can we actually test EIPM empirically? Where does the rubber meet the road?
This is crucial for it to be more than just philosophy. EIPM makes specific claims linking information dynamics, FEP, brain activity, and subjective reports. The researchers propose concrete research programs.
Like in neuroscience, what could we look for in the brain?
A key target is the thalamocortical system, those massive loops between the thalamus and cortex, known to be critical for consciousness. EIPM predicts conscious awareness depends on high integration and active prediction within these loops.
So you could measure either during different states.
Exactly. Use advanced EEG fMRI to estimate yeet, see how it changes with wakefulness, sleep, anesthesia, maybe even during specific conscious experiences. You could also use techniques like transcranial magnetic stimulation, TMS, or deep brain stimulation, DBS, to perturb these circuits and see if changes in 8 correlate with reported changes in awareness.
What about that PCI measure, perturbational complexity index?
Right, PCI measures how complexly the brain responds to a direct perturbation like a TMS pulse. It's already known to correlate well with consciousness levels. EIPM predicts a tighter link. The richness or vividness of subjective experience should track closely with PCI values.
So more vivid experience, higher PCI.
That's the prediction. You could test this using, say, varying levels of sedation or attention, getting detailed subjective reports alongside PCI measurements.
And what about those big computational brain models like BrainLM?
They fit right into the predictive processing side of EIPM. These models try to predict upcoming brain activity. EIPM suggests the brain's efficiency at minimizing prediction error should relate to conscious awareness or access. You could compare how well these models predict brain states during tasks where people report being aware versus unaware of stimuli.
Okay, shifting from brains to AI, how do we test EIPM there? Can we build conscious machines based on this?
Well, that's the long-term goal for some. The idea would be to explicitly design AI architectures to maximize both AA and active inference capabilities, train them in complex, dynamic virtual environments where they have to predict and act to achieve goals.
And look for what? Signs of consciousness.
Signs of behaviors that suggest an emerging inner life. Things like flexible problem solving, spontaneous goal setting, maybe expressing uncertainty or curiosity in ways that seem analogous to subjective states rather than just executing pre-programmed routines.
They mentioned adapting animal consciousness tests, like the mirror test.
Yeah, that's an intriguing idea. Could a high-odd active inference AI in a virtual world recognize its reflection or react appropriately to a delayed feed of its own actions? Could it show signs of metacognition, knowing what it knows or doesn't know in specifically designed tasks? These are empirical questions EIPM motivates.
And this ties back to AI ethics.
Directly. If A and active inference are measurable correlates of consciousness, then maybe we could eventually develop objective criteria, thresholds perhaps, for assessing the potential for experience in AI. This could guide ethical debates about AI rights or moral status, moving beyond just behavior or human resemblance.
What about the more speculative physics connections, quantum stuff?
Yeah, this is more out there. EIPM doesn't require quantum mechanics, but it keeps the door open. Some wonder if the fundamental proto-experiential aspect might ultimately link to quantum information or phenomena like entanglement.
How could you even test that?
Very difficult. Maybe look for correlations between quantum information measures like entanglement entropy in simplified systems and classical measures of A. Or perhaps highly sensitive experiments looking for quantum effects in neural processing, though that's hugely debated and technically challenging. It's more of a frontier exploration.
So EIPM suggests a whole research program. What are the milestones? What comes first?
Near term. Definitely refining the tools to measure reliably and to quantify active inference in both biological and artificial systems. Also, more studies directly correlating these measures with detailed subjective reports, maybe using psychedelics or meditation to access wider ranges of conscious states.
Midterm.
Building and testing those bespoke AI systems designed around EIPM principles, seeing if they develop novel capacities or behaviors suggestive of proto-consciousness in rich simulated environments.
And long-term.
That's where the really ambitious goals lie. Clinical trials using eye-based diagnostics or therapies for coma or vegetative states, establishing widely accepted ethical guidelines for advanced AI based on these principles, maybe even finding those elusive links to fundamental physics if they exist.
So it's clear EIPM aims to be more than just armchair philosophy. It wants to drive science and have real-world impact. What are some of those broader implications, ethical, technological?
They're potentially huge. Clinically, as we just touched on, better diagnostics and treatments for disorders of consciousness. Imagine being able to reliably tell if a non-communicative patient has underlying awareness based on their brain, say.
That would be revolutionary.
Absolutely. Also, guiding the development of brain-computer interfaces or neuroprosthetics that integrate more naturally with conscious experience, and perhaps more precise monitoring of anesthetic depth during surgery.
We covered AI ethics using AI or active inference as potential markers for moral consideration. What else?
Well, they also raise environmental ethics. If even simple informational processes have some faint proto-experience, does that change how we view ecosystems?
How so?
Destroying a complex ecosystem might not just be losing species, but extinguishing countless lines of ongoing, minimally experiential processes. It could add a different kind of weight to conservation arguments, beyond just utility or biodiversity.
That's a really interesting, if challenging, idea. And philosophically, how might EIPM change our basic understanding of things?
You could reframe a lot.
Yeah.
Epistemology, the theory of knowledge. Maybe knowing isn't just representing the world passively, but actively participating in an informational exchange, integrating perspective.
And metaphysics.
A big shift from seeing reality as made of static stuff, substances, to seeing it as dynamic process, information flow, and integration. It changes the fundamental picture.
Any other areas?
Potentially aesthetics, maybe artworks, by creating patterns that resonate with our brain's predictive models in a particularly integrated, high and meaningful way. And ethics could well-being itself be understood partly as achieving states of high integration and positive subjective valence. These are all avenues EIPM opens up.
Okay, so wrapping this all up. Embodied Informational-Process Monism, EIPM, is proposing a really different picture of reality, isn't it?
It really is. Fundamentally, it's saying reality is this dynamic tapestry woven from proto-experiential information. And consciousness, our consciousness, isn't something totally separate, but emerges as a particularly complex, highly integrated, actively predicting knot within that universal tapestry.
And the significance is, well, it tries to dissolve that ancient mind-matter divide.
Exactly. It offers a potential way past that chasm. Plus, it aims to ground ethics in something more than just intuition. And importantly, it provides a concrete research program, a set of testable ideas for scientists and philosophers to actually work with.
And we should stress again, the creators frame this as a research heuristic. It's not dogma.
Not at all. It's presented as a starting point, a framework to guide thinking and experimentation, meant to be refined, challenged, maybe even overturned by future work. It's an invitation to explore.
Yeah, they're actively encouraging people, neuroscientists, AI researchers, philosophers, anyone interested, to engage with it, test it, critique it.
It's a call for collaboration on some of the biggest questions we face.
Well, this deep dive into EIPM definitely leaves you with a lot to chew on.
Yeah.
You start wondering, maybe the universe isn't just cold, empty space and particles.
Right. Maybe it's more like a vast network, subtly imbued with potential experience, and our own minds are just incredibly dense, active centers within that network.
What does that really mean for who we are and our place in everything? It's
Okay.
yeah, something to really ponder.